Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar here today. Today, I want to talk to you guys all about milestones. Specifically, we're going to talk about what are milestones, what are some of the most common milestones that people are seeing, and as a neurologically based chiropractor, what are some of the things that we look for in development and some of the things that we need to look for as parents to know how our child is developing. So I'm going to share my screen here with you right now and we're going to go ahead and get started. So, like I said, I'm Dr. Trevor. I'm the chiropractor here at Foundations Chiropractic. And let's go ahead and dig into some milestones. So, first of all, we want to start off with what exactly are milestones? General rule of thumb here is that milestones are these specific behaviors or skills that infants and children have that they grow up and they grow into and develop with. These are whether they're physical skills, cognitive, most of the time, these are skills that kids will exhibit at certain ages as they grow up or get older. And they really do offer a good benchmark into a child's neurologic and physical progress. The markers are going to be fundamental indicators of how well the brain and the nervous system is maturing, along with certain specific parts of the brain. And there are four main categories or skills that are going to correlate with different brains, different areas of the brain and the nervous system that we're going to look at. So, one would be the motor skills. These are the things that people typically think of when you think of milestones. This is skills like rolling over, sitting, standing, walking, and those kind of things. They all are going to demonstrate some sort of physical coordination or balance and some muscle control. They're really closely linked to development in the brainstem, so the bottom part of the brain, and the motor cortex of the brain. So it's really important that we have this baseline of motor development, and then it builds on that from there, because our brains are built from the bottom up and then back to the front. Bottom meaning the brainstem, front of the brain meaning the frontal cortex or the motor cortex, the cortices of the brain. Another skill that they're going to be working on with milestones are these cognition skills. So that's like recognizing an object or playing interactive games. They're going to signal more of the mental processes in the body, like memory development and basic reasoning. These areas are going to reflect how well the cortical regions, so the big brain thought regions of the brain are developing and forming. The ones that are involved with like processing. So that's really a big part of the brain. Third skill is the social and emotional skill. These ones are making eye contact is a big one, responding to their name. All these are going to show early social awareness and emotional regulation areas. And that's exactly where they affect the brain, and the brain development is the limbic area, limbic system development, which is the emotional seat. And then finally, we have the language and communication skills as the milestone. And that's going to be things like speaking words, forming sentences, right? Development in the language areas of the brain. So when we talk about all these milestones, why do they even matter? Well, milestones are going to serve as the reflection of how those underlying structures I just mentioned are growing and how well they are developing in the brain. For example, if a child starts to reach for objects at a certain point or certain milestone, that milestone indicates that their brain's visual, so their eyes are working properly, the motor and the sensory system, all three are working and developed in harmonies, and none of them are lagging behind. And when we can observe these milestone progressions, we can then monitor if the child's growth is aligning with typical pattern that we should be seeing for that kid. I want to jump into some of the common developmental milestones that people are seeing, and we'll kind of break it up into these three categories. So we have 0 to 1, which is a ton happening in that 1 year. This is a big one where people typically think of for the physical skills. So head control is obviously the first one people think about. That's around that 0 to 2 month range. As we move on, rolling over is the next one, about 4 to 6, which they're starting to require that coordination to the core and muscles and the arms and legs. Crawling is another one. That's going to be one of the biggest ones in this area. And that's really important for what I'm going to talk about here later on in this webinar is crawling is super important and it's a really critical milestone for this bilateral coordination. So both sides of the body coordination, because it requires both sides of the brain to communicate not only effectively, but efficiently in order to have proper movement and that spatial awareness. Finally, we should be starting to see the first steps around that 9 to 12 months range, not necessarily walking on their own, but just their first steps. And then we also have more cognitive and sensory skills happening too. 0 to 3 months, they're starting to track faces and focusing on faces, which is why it's also important that they have head control around that same time so that they can follow people's faces around with their heads. And around that 4 to 6 month range, when they're starting to roll over and crawl, we should be seeing them reaching and grasping for things, which is another sensory skill as they're getting their hands, that tactile sensation going to the body and the brain. And then finally, we have the social and emotional skills because there is that in this first year as well. Starting to smile is a major sign that we're seeing some development in the body. It's one of the earliest social milestones that we can see around that we should see around the 2 to 3 month range. Stranger anxiety is a big one. So if your kid doesn't have that, that's something that needs to be looked at. They should have this by 6 to 8 months old. Another thing about that is around that 9 month age, 8 to 9 month old age, is when they're also starting to realize that they are their own person and they're not just an extension of mom. This is also why we see a lot of regression around that 9 month age because they pick their head up and realize, oh, I'm my own person. Mom's not just there. Mom's not always a part of me. Um, and another thing that we're seeing around that same age range at 6 to 9 months should be that they are at least responding to your name as we see some of that audio or auditory stimulation, sensory development happening in their brain as well. Moving on to the next period, that 1 to 3 years old range, more of the toddler milestones. Motor skills are continuing to develop. We still want to see certain milestones being hit where they're walking independently now. So between 12 to 15 months old, we really want to see your kid walking. And then building on that, climbing and running up to about a year or 2 years. So the 18 to 24 month range. The other thing about that 18 to 24 month range is we should start seeing some more fine motor control. So scribbling, stacking blocks, as they're growing their hand-eye coordination, building that confidence in all the foundational work they did in the first year with motor development. Another thing is using a spoon. So that's a big part about feeding themselves because that's a big fine motor control, fine motor skill that we should be seeing in these kids. Cognitive and language skills are going to be bigger in this period that people typically think of. They should be starting to seeing their first words between that 12 to 18 month range. General rule of thumb here is they should be saying single words at about a year, and they should be saying 2 word sentences at about 2 years. So that 2 year range is when they're combining words. Toddlers are starting to have more of this early syntactic understanding and memory, which linking their emotional needs and objects to convey these bigger thoughts that they're starting to feel about themselves. And they should be able to follow simple instructions of go bring me this or go sit down or those kind of things. We also have some more of the social emotional skills developing in this range. They should be starting to point more and gesturing to certain things in a meaningful way and not just they're reaching and grasping like we see the 4 to 6 month range. And parallel play around 2 years old is a big part in this age range. Not necessarily playing well with each other, but playing alongside of other children is a really big thing that it's starting to reflect these early social skills and self-awareness in these kids. Um, the other thing that we're also seeing about that 18 to 24 month range is kids are starting to imitate more. So that's a lot of times when we get this terrible twos is they're being a little defiant, but they're also imitating what they're seeing in other kids and in us as parents and caregivers and those kind of things. Finally, as we move towards that 3 to 5 year range, that's really when the bigger brain activities are starting to happen. So we're getting more complex on everything that we built on to this point. So the motor skills, a lot of the more of the fine motor control, they should be able to draw shapes and basic writing of letters between that 4 to 5 year range. As the hand-eye coordination, the visual processing abilities are improved, and they should be doing a lot more of the self-care tasks. So between 4 to 5 years, they should be able to be dressing themselves, brushing their teeth independently. Another thing in the cognitive and language skill portion in this 3 to 5 year range is they should be able to be counting and doing some simple problem solving between that 4 to 5 year range. The other thing is we get the why question. This is the why phase. They should be asking questions between this 3 to 5 year period, starting with whys. So whys are a big one. I know it can be that annoying as a parent. Why? And that's just because your kid is trying to explore these cause and effect relationships. And it's a really important milestone that we should be seeing in our kids. As we move a little bit deeper into the social and emotional skills, instead of the parallel play, we should be seeing kids that are playing cooperatively with each other between that 4 to 5 year range. So if you're still seeing parallel play, that typically can be a little bit of lagging in that social development side of things. Another thing that we're starting to see is some more empathy happening in that time period. A really big one between the 3 to 5 year range, a big milestone is skills like calming down, self-regulatory skills are starting to show up, and they should be showing up more consistently. Kids showing empathy, recognizing emotions is a really big thing that it shows that that limbic system or the emotional seat in the brain is really continuing to develop. And the prefrontal cortex, so the big part of the brain in the front, is also starting to mature, supporting this emotional regulation. Because the prefrontal cortex is kind of what puts the brakes on our limbic system, our emotions. And when we see that development of bottom up limbic forward to the prefrontal, we're starting to see more of that emotional regulation. So just some of the common milestones that we're looking for and what we're looking for with those. When I talk about timing, yes, timing does matter in these milestones, but the order that those milestones are happening is so much more important. While the age that kids reach milestones can vary a lot, like I said, the order that those milestones are achieved typically will follow this predictable sequence. For instance, babies usually sit before they crawl, and they crawl before they walk. That sequential order really reflects how the nervous system is maturing. As each milestone builds upon the skill and the neurologic development established by previous milestones. Each developmental stage will create this foundation for the next, enabling the brain and the body to really coordinate increasingly more complex functions and improve that development of that bottom up brain development. That progression also mirrors the development of those neural pathways, which can become stronger and more interconnected as that kid begins to continue to practice and master those new skills. So, again, talking about just as an example about the order, let's talk about crawling, a huge milestone. And that requires, like I said before, that coordinated movement between both sides of the body. It also requires the coordinated movement between both sides of the brain or both hemispheres of the brain, really foundational for balance, spatial awareness, and then later skills like reading is also a big cross hemispheric coordination issue or cross hemispheric coordination um, uh, milestone that we need to see. And when a kid skips crawling and moves directly to walking, that cross body connection and coordination skills might not fully mature. This can lead them to difficulties in coordination and balance, and even language or learning difficulties later in life, all because they didn't crawl like they were supposed to. So it's really important to look at these sequences and not skip milestones. Now, each child is unique and timing can vary widely, often influenced by the environment, genetics, or just individual temperament. So, while a kid might not walk at 10 months, while others might start walking at 12 or even 15 months. Like I am harping on so much, is that as long as the child progresses through each milestone in sequence, a slight delay in timing doesn't typically indicate an issue. Timing does matter though when those milestones are significantly delayed. For instance, if a child's not sitting up by 10 months or they're not showing signs of crawling by 12 months, those delays may indicate this possible issue more in this neurologic development. And in those cases, it's really, really important to look at these underlying factors that might be hindering that progression through the typical milestone sequence. And that's exactly where people like us here at Foundations, as neurologically based chiropractor, what we're looking at and what we're going to look where we will come into play and figuring out what might be going on a deeper neurologic level. So, as I keep talking about neurologic level and neurology and those kind of things, there is this big neurologic basis for milestones. These are milestones are where the body's expression of these neural connections that are built and they're continuously refined through each milestone. And as a child achieves new skills, the brain's neural pathways are strengthened. Neuroplasticity, or how the brain and the body adapts, is continuing to grow and change. And myelination is starting to happen more often, which is basically an insulation of this nerve fiber that helps it to signal faster and more efficiently and more coordinated. So we get a lot more coordination and communication between the brain and the muscles and the brain and the rest of the body. And so these synapses are going to grow larger and faster and more, excuse me, and the more that they're used, when a strong foundation is built for other pathways to feed off of, they were going to enhance that development even further. One really cool thing that the body does as well is it's called synaptic pruning. And what that is the brain will actually remove these unused neural connections to enhance the efficiency that of the pathways that we are using consciously, or those necessary pathways to help refine some of those motor and social and cognition responses. Another big thing is as a child interacts with their environment, that sensory information also integrates with the brain and supports the balance and movement and awareness even further. So, as those developments happen, that specifically that sensory development happens, we're getting more signals to the brain, and each milestone is going to reflect that interplay between the development of the structures that I mentioned earlier, with the brainstem, the limbic system, and then the cortical functions, helping those children to manage and adapt the world around them, because that's going to be the name of the game, is how well our kids are adapting, because life is going to happen. Life happens to us, life is going to happen to our kids. We want our kids to be able to adapt. And if they have delays in milestones, delays in sequencing, they're not going to be adapted like they're supposed to, because they're not going to sense the environment like they're supposed to. One thing I want to bring up here too is CDC's recent, and by recent, a couple of years ago, changes to milestones. The CDC made a couple changes in 2022 where they made changes in order to address a wider range of development in kids. So what they were doing, I can appreciate. They wanted to reduce these unnecessary concerns, but they made a lot of changes that can make a huge effect on families and kids. Number one, they took out crawling as a milestone. So no longer a milestone that's recognized by the CDC. Another thing is walking was pushed back. So it was pushed back from 12 months to 18 months. And talking, specifically saying single words, went from that 12 months to 15 months. Why that's a problem is that approach is going to risk overlooking these early signs of developmental delays in kids. And that can also lead to parents and caregivers overlooking delays that, when addressed earlier, tend to have better outcomes. This is also where a neurologically based chiropractor can come into play, because if we can get in early and often, we can help to not only reach the delayed milestones, but get that kid's nervous system back on track so that we can hit and excel in those milestones and that development moving forward. A big thing about these milestones is these changes really can lead to this false sense of reoccurrence. And God made our bodies with a purpose, right? He didn't make junk. And just because your kid isn't crawling anymore, or kid skips crawling, That doesn't mean that they're going to be totally fine with social, emotional, language departments. All developmental areas of the brain are going to be delayed following delays in other areas. And that's because that most basic foundational layer of milestones isn't hitting the right sequence that they're supposed to, or they're hitting them way too late. And I would say another main issue here is that kids are not growing into these milestones, or they're not growing out of these milestones. When there's a delay, that wait and see approach doesn't work. The body continues to grow. Delayed approach can really widen these developmental gaps, making it really a lot more challenging for these kids to pass up as they, or these kids to catch up as they continue to grow older. Now, what can we do as neurologically based chiropractors? So I said that a lot, right? So neurologically based chiropractors. And that's why I say that is because we're not just focused on moving a bone back into place. We're focused on getting the brain and the body communicating like they're supposed to so that the neurology, the brain and the nervous system can function like it's supposed to. Our style of care will focus on correcting these areas of interference that um, disrupt that communication between the brain and the body, which tend to lead or can lead to delays and issues in these motor or sensory skills. And as we can address these imbalances early and often, this type of care can help ensure that the brain and the nervous system can support these milestone achievements by optimizing that brain body connection. Another really cool thing about how we can help with milestone progression is the autonomic nervous system, which is a part of our nervous system, or automatic nervous system, which regulates all of the things that we don't consciously control, how our heart's beating, how our body's digesting food, how our lungs are breathing. It also affects our children's ability to self-regulate, how they regulate with their emotions and cope with stress. A balanced autonomic nervous system is essential for smooth motor development and sensory processing. As an overactive autonomic nervous system can put the body into this constant fight or flight, gas pedal stuck on mode, it hampers that growth and learning and development. Our adjustments are really cool in the way that they are super gentle, but the way that can also help to regulate the autonomic nervous system, which can then reduce tension overall and stress in the body, promoting more of a balanced autonomic nervous system and encouraging this state of a calm, regulated nervous system that's really conductive to growth, healing, development, learning, and really achieving those developmental milestones. Chiropractic care doesn't speed up milestone progression or achievements, but it really does support the natural sequence of development by facilitating the optimal body mechanics and the nervous system that's already in all these kids. So, with that, I want to close with just a couple conclusion thoughts, just to wrap everything up into a nice, neat little bow. So, number one, developmental milestones, they're really important. They indicate how well the brain and the neurology is growing and developing and in what sequence it's developing to help ensure that our child's overall well being is being tracked and well maintained. The order is way more important, and then the timing of these milestones being achieved, as that structural progression really reflects, again, those underlying neurologic foundations. And as neurologically based chiropractic care, as neurologically based chiropractors, our care can support this natural milestone progression and by supporting optimal nervous system functioning. While we maintain strong milestone standards, it's really critical for proactive development, which is why we encourage parents and family members, caregivers to seek chiropractors early, these neurologically based chiropractors early, rather than adopting this wait and see approach or they'll grow out of it approach, because kids aren't growing out of things. It grows into bigger issues that are a lot harder to take care of. So, with that being said, I want to thank you all for joining me here today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We can talk you through what our care would look like for you or your family. If you know one of your kids or a nephew, a niece, a family member, a friend has a kid that's not reaching a milestone, or you don't think they're quite to where they should be at, send them our way. we are happy to look at what you got going on, do some scans in our office, figure out where the nervous system is not working like it's supposed to, get your kiddo, get your family member back on track so you guys can have this happy, thriving development kid in your life. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you got a lot of great information.